Good evening, everyone. The American Horticultural Society is pleased to welcome you to today's program, Conversations with Great American Gardeners, featuring a dialogue between Doug Tallamy and Holly Shimizu. For the past 70 years, the American Horticultural Society's Great American Gardener Awards have recognized excellence in the plant professions. Speakers in this year's three-part webinar series are selected from among the awardees. These webinars and all AHS programs share about the critical role of plants, gardens, and green spaces in creating healthy, livable communities and a sustainable planet. Now, I may be a new face for some of you. My name is Courtney Allen, and I joined the American Horticultural Society this past winter as the Director of National Programs. I come with a background and a passion in gardens programming, landscape history, and museum education. Prior to AHS, I directed and managed educational programs for the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, as well as for Native Plant Trust and the Huntington Gardens. So I'm delighted to be a part of the AHS team and to grow our national programs in exciting new ways. As we begin tonight's program, a reminder that we are in webinar format. This is a format used for large audiences. We have several hundred registrants for this program tonight. In webinar format, only the presenters have their cameras and their mics enabled, and the chat and hand raise functions are not available to audience members in this format. However, you are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of our program this evening. I'm pleased to introduce our conversation facilitator for the evening, Holly Shimizu. Holly has been a lover of plants, gardens, and nature since her childhood. After studying horticulture at Penn State, she worked in European gardens for over 3 years. Upon her return, she became the first curator of the National Herb Garden at the U.S. National Arboretum and received her Master's of Science in Horticulture from the University of Maryland. She worked as managing director of the Lewis Skinter Botanical Garden in Richmond, Virginia, and was then executive director of the U.S. Botanic Garden for 15 years. Currently, Holly is on the board of the American Horticultural Society and the American Botanical Council. She heads the environmental committee in her town and writes for their newspaper. She wrote and illustrated her first children's book, Figgy and Fiona Search for a Home, and is now working on her second book. Holly has received many awards and honors for her work. And for over 10 years, Holly was one of the hosts of the Victory Garden television show on PBS. So a warm welcome to Holly, who will introduce tonight's featured guest, Doug Tallamy.
Thank you so much, Courtney. So I'd love to introduce Doug Tallamy. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has been writing huge numbers of research papers and teaching courses for 41 years. Doug has had an extraordinary impact on gardeners and people interested in gardening for many years. I would say he has changed many lives through his work. He's enlightened us about the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His fantastic books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, New York Times bestseller, The Nature of Oaks. That book won an AHS 2022 Book Award, and Nature's Best Hope for young readers between ages 8 and 12. So he co-founded in 2021 Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandari. He's received a long list of awards for his work, but I would say Doug is considered a hero to many because in his interesting ways, he provides solutions and guidance on how we can enhance the richness and health of our gardens and the nature that within and around them. So thank you, Doug, for joining us tonight. And I thought maybe we would start with having you just tell us about how you see the role of ecology and gardening blended together.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Holly. You didn't talk about all the people who think I'm public enemy number one. You skipped that part, but
We defend you.
Ecology and gardening. We have to remember what a primary role of plants is on this planet. They're generating all the food. They capture energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis, they turn it into simple sugars and carbohydrates. And that is the food that all of us, just about all the animals on the planet depend on. But only if you get that food to the animals. If you don't get the food to the animals, you don't have any animals. If you don't have any animals, you don't have functioning ecosystems, and then you don't have humans. So gardeners, of course, love plants. They are manipulating that first trophic level that is vital to everything else on the planet. That puts them in a really powerful position because they can determine how well that system of plants works in terms of passing on that energy, or how well it doesn't work. So it's a very important interaction.
And what about the beauty of the garden, which is so important to so many? And you cover this really in your book, The Living Landscape, Designing for Beauty and Biodiversity in the Home Garden, and making sure, if that's what you want, that you incorporate beauty and biodiversity at the same time.
Well, I'd see this as the great new challenge for gardeners and landscape designers and landscape architects, the great challenge of our times. In the past, we've had one goal for our landscapes, and that is for them to be pretty. We're not going to give that up. We want them to be pretty, but now they have to also be ecologically functional, and that's two goals. But it is a new challenge. But we've been gardening the old way for a couple hundred years. It's time for a new challenge, and everybody can get into this. How do we have ecologically functional landscapes? I always talk about landscapes instead of gardens because it's the whole package. Whatever piece of your property that you own is contributing or not. So how do we make that aesthetically pleasing and ecologically functional at the same time? That does take design skills. It takes horticultural knowledge. It takes ecological knowledge. It's a combination of all three.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I've learned from you is about some of the specialized relationships between plants and insects and birds and all of these things and the food web. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, I always say that nature is comprised largely of specialized interactions. And most of those interactions are between animals and plants. And a good many of them are between insects and plants. Insects, of course, the insect herbivores eat plants, and plants don't want to be eaten. So they do their best to protect themselves from insect herbivores. So they have physical defenses, they've got chemical defenses, they have phenological defenses, and they employ them all. So most insects that eat plants can only eat the plants that they have gotten very good at getting around those defenses. They've evolved adaptations that allow them to circumvent them. And of course, I use the monarch butterfly as a great example. Milkweeds are toxic plants. They defend themselves not just with cardiac glycosides, but also that sticky latex sap that gels when it hits the air. But monarchs can get around those things. It physiologically detoxifies the cardiac glycosides, and it blocks the flow of the sticky latex sap by snipping the veins of the main leaves. By it, I mean the caterpillars. And those are great adaptations, but they've locked the the monarch into eating milkweed. So specialization is great as long as both players are present. But if you take the milkweed away, then the monarch's in big trouble. And that's that central message. We have to have all the players for those specialized interactions that are nature to function.
Yeah, so your work really focuses on individuals and their private green spaces. So I'm curious why you chose that as your area to focus on rather than larger green swaths of public spaces.
Well, 78% of the country is privately owned. 85.6 east of the Mississippi is privately owned. We've got about 145 or 135 million acres of residential landscapes out there. It's big chunks of land that private landowners, mostly residential landscapers, are in charge of. Now we do have parks, we do have preserves, but we are in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, which means they're not working. They're not enough. We've got 3.6% of the country is in national parks, and only 12% is formally protected at the federal level. So that leaves a lot of area outside of those protected areas. And even those protected areas are only protected until Congress changes their mind, which we see they do fairly often. So I think the future of conservation is on private property, and that means the private landowner is the future of conservation. So my goal has been to tell them that, because most of them don't know that. They think nature's happy someplace else because it used to be, but it's not. It's not. So now it's actually just a wonderful opportunity. You really can turn your property into the future of conservation, and it's not that hard.
Yes, no, that's true. And, if you look down from a plane, I think that's really a wake-up call, because you see that our green spaces aren't connected. And so
Yeah.
you imagine life as a bird or a caterpillar or some other living creature, and you're like, how do you get from here to here?
Yeah. What if you're a box turtle or a salamander? You've got to cross a road.
Right, right.
Very, very, very isolated. The road situation is a real issue for moving animals, and I haven't tackled that one yet. But we can connect green spaces a lot more than we're doing. So that's a really important point. Every bit of conservation we do outside of a protected area helps conservation inside of that protected area. Right now, in so many places outside of those areas, it's no man's land. If you leave the preserve, that's it. There's nothing there for you. But as we fill in those gaps, we create, I don't like the term biological corridor because it suggests it's just a place for plants and animals to move back and forth. We need to create viable habitat between those preserved places so that they're not just moving back and forth, they're actually living outside of the protected area. And the more we do that, the happier everything will be, the more sustainable it truly will be.
Yeah. Well, in your fantastic book, Nature's Best Hope, you delve into the decline of native plants as a main cause, the decline in wildlife. And what do you define as a native plant? I never argue about it. I think we all have our own definition, but what's yours?
A plant that co-evolved with the plants and animals around it.
Yes.
So that allows movement, because our native plant communities do move. When the glaciers came down, they all moved down to the Gulf Coast, then they moved back. They're still moving. And the animals that use those plants move with them to a greater or lesser extent. So it's not a fixed, a native plant is more than just the plant right down the street. It's one that's going to have the provenance necessary to survive where you are, and the interactions that allow it to be productive. We can see, we did a study looking at red oak. Oaks are really productive plants. We measured insect activity on red oaks in Pennsylvania, where it's part of their natural range, and red oaks in Portland, Oregon, where they're planted ornamentally, but it's not part of their natural range. So red oaks in Pennsylvania, one of the most productive plants. Everything's using a red oak. In Oregon, nothing. So it's moved totally outside of the range in which it interacted with things that were adapted to it. So even though there's the Oregon oak there, it's not that there are no oak feeders. They're not going to use red oak because they didn't co-evolve with it. So in Oregon, it's not a native plant. In Pennsylvania, it is.
Yeah, so interesting, really. Well, what concerns you the most that is declining and that you think we should be paying attention to?
I'll answer that generally. We tend to focus on extinction events or pending extinction as the real threat because we don't want to lose any species. But really, it's the decline of common species that are the real threat, because it's the common species that are running our ecosystems. So things like the rusty patch bumblebee used to be one of the most common bumblebees in the country. Now it's on the verge of extinction. The passenger pigeon was the most common bird on the entire planet. These had huge impacts on their local ecosystems. The chestnut, American chestnut, dominant tree from Georgia, from Maine all the way down to Georgia along the crest of the mountains. Losing those things had just huge impacts. So we should focus on the common species that are contributing so much right now. And I'm looking again at oaks for that. They're under attack by at least 3 really important diseases. We continue to cut them down. The bourbon industry in Kentucky still makes its barrels out of white oak, and it's really having a serious impact on our forests.
Ah.
So oaks are still common, but we need to keep them common.
Yes.
All these diseases, I hear people say, well, we won't plant oaks anymore. No, we've got to find the resistant varieties and plant them. And the resistance is out there, so.
Right. And I think, does that speak to growing them from acorns so that we get the genetic diversity and can then see which ones are going to thrive?
Well, we want to look at the trees that exist right now. So on my property, I've lost 2 or 3 black oaks to oak leaf scorch, a couple of red oaks, they're already dead, but I've got several that are just fine. So I would say they're probably resistant. Those are the acorns that we should be favoring.
Yes.
I think we need to do actual big trials at this point. Look at the trees that haven't died. These diseases are everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I know you have talked about the debate of nativars, cultivars of natives. Where do you stand on that?
Well, everybody wants to know, are they as good as the straight species ecologically?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. And the answer is it depends. It depends on what the genetic trait was that created the cultivar. First of all, a lot of cultivars are actually varieties that nature created. Somebody found a plant with a trait in the wild that they liked. So they brought it in and put a name on it. We call that a cultivar, but nature created that. That's just as good as anything else. When we actively select for something, then it depends. So we did an experiment looking at 6 different cultivar traits with woody plants. The only one that impacted insects in a negative way was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. That loads the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. The other traits, taking a tall plant, making it short, or introducing disease resistance, enhancing berry size, they didn't have any impacts on the insects at all. One thing that's pretty consistent with our cultivars, though, it's not universal, but it's pretty consistent, is that they're propagated clonally, which means within that cultivar, there's 0 genetic variability. And in this day and age with climate change, which is not a gradual warming of the climate, it's erratic, hot, cold, wet, dry. We need as much genetic variability in our plant populations as possible. So, cultivars, particularly ones that introduce disease resistance, they can play an important trait. Or taking a tall plant, making it short, allows a lot of these plants to be used in smaller areas. But I would love to see the straight species sold along with the cultivar.
Yeah.
So that the let the market work it out. Give the buyer a choice. Right now, if you go to a lot of nurseries, there's nothing but cultivars, and
I know that's true, but I do see native plant nurseries are really evolving in a positive way. And, some are so strict that it needs to be, within a close range of where you are.
Yeah, that's provenance. I mean, then you're going to have a genotype that is already adapted to your altitude and your latitude, and in some cases your soil type. Great. But in terms of what I focus on, which is the food web, the insects don't really care. You can take something eats beech, they'll be happy with a beech from Florida or a beech from Canada or a beech from Missouri. They don't really care. the plant won't grow from Florida. It won't grow in Canada, even though it's the same species. So that's where provenance becomes important. But
Yes,
the insects are not as picky as people think they are.
yes. So the wildlife population decline, and I know you talk about the insect apocalypse. Talk a little bit about the causes of other causes of why this is happening.
Dave Wagner at the University of Connecticut calls insect decline the causes of death by 1,000 cuts, because there's so many causes. The misuse and overuse of pesticides certainly is a cause. Light pollution at night is underappreciated. Every day we have more and more lights on. Those lights, when they are white lights or have a bluish tint, are very attractive to nocturnal insects, particularly the moths that create the caterpillars that run our food web. So they're very hard on our insects. What's frustrating
What
about
should we
that is
do? Sorry.
put in yellow bulbs, yellow wavelengths, because that's not attractive to these. So that's a very easy fix. Well, an even easier fix is turn out your light. We have these lights on as a habit. I suppose they're supposed to be security lights, but we could put motion sensors on them so they only turn on when the bad man comes. But
yeah,
people have lights on all the time. Put the yellow bulb in, that will help a lot.
okay.
Mosquito fogging is a huge problem for insects because, first of all, it doesn't control mosquitoes and it does kill everything else. And we do it because we think it's controlling insects, but
Yes.
you don't control insects you don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. And the mosquito fogging companies kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to working. But when they fog, it kills all the pollinators, all the monarchs, all the things that we're trying to preserve. And you get the effect of that, whether you hire the guy or not. If it does your neighbor, it floats over onto your property.
Yeah, so we tell us how you would rather have us get rid of our mosquitoes.
You control mosquitoes, and mosquito commissions know this, and they've always done it in the larval stage. And the homeowner can do it effectively by creating you're creating an ecological trap. You make a brew and in a bucket that is so attractive to ovipositing mosquitoes, to female mosquitoes that are going to lay their eggs. They will come to your little bucket. And it's easy to do that. You get a bucket and you fill it full of water and you put in a handful of straw or hay or even a little bit of dead grass. And that builds up populations of diatoms and algae. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. So the mosquito lays his egg in there. Then you go to the hardware store, and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks, DUNK. It's Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larvae. So we are going to control mosquitoes, but it's targeted. We're only going to control mosquitoes. We're not going to, willy-nilly kill everything that's out there. And it works.
Yay. Yeah, well, this is a big problem. I see it all over the place. So it's upsetting. People don't really know. So do you think there are certain areas of this country that are more at risk than others, or how do you view that?
Well, there is a map that you can find online that outlines the hotspots of biodiversity in this country. So there's large parts of California that are all colored in, large parts of Texas, large parts of Florida. But, there's biodiversity pretty much everywhere. And the greater the biodiversity, the greater the risk. There's a very tight correlation between the number of species and the impact that we're having on those species.
Okay, so I just finished reading The Nature of Oaks. That is a really fantastic book, and it dispelled a lot of things that I had learned about trees. And so I'd love you to talk about oaks and young oaks and grouping oaks and some of the things people have said to you about why they don't want oaks. You have reasons why those things aren't really valid.
Yeah. All right, let's start with that. I do hear all the time, oaks grow too slowly and I won't live long enough to enjoy it. They get too big for your property. They're going to fall over and crush your house. They're going to lift up your hardscape. So, I call them landscaping myths about oaks. And usually there's some degree of truth associated with a myth. So and they're too expensive to buy. Well, they are too expensive to buy if you insist on planting a large tree. Oaks have big root systems, and it's, we have figured out how to grow large trees in air pots where the roots are not root bound, but it's still a small root system for the size of the tree in that pot. You get your instant gratification, but when you plant it, it just sits there for a decade trying to rebuild the root system it needs to support all the green material. You certainly never want to plant something that's root bound because that'll just continue to strangle itself and then die. So you can get around that by planting a small oak. They really do grow quickly. The oaks that I put in on our property, I guess it was 2001. They were acorns, and those trees are all over 60 feet tall now. Didn't take that long, and so before they were 60 feet tall, they were 50, then they were 40, they were 30. They were still good landscape plants. They do grow slowly in the beginning when they're laying down that big root system. So that's what that gives them the impression that they're really slow growing. But I'm gonna throw that one out. After the first couple of years, they grow as fast as anything else, particularly members of the red oak group. I planted oaks here, but the blue jays planted a lot too. And they planted a lot of them in inappropriate places, and I haven't had the heart to take them out. So right behind me is a window, and right outside that window is a pin oak that a blue jay planted. It's way too close to the house, and it is 60 feet tall now. So yeah, I've got an issue, but oaks do grow. Oaks do grow. Are they going to lift up your hardscape? It depends on what you plant them over. So if you plant them over bedrock, the only place the roots can go is laterally. And yes, they will lift it up, but so will anything else. If you plant them in good soil, no, I've got lots of good examples of how those roots go down and they don't disturb the hardscape.
And then clustering them. I love
clustering them. Yeah. Where are they going to blow over on your house? We plant every tree, not just oaks, but every tree as a specimen tree, because we want it to not compete with anything else and reach its full splendor. And I understand that, but that does leave them vulnerable to the wild weather that we're having. You get a lot of rain and then wind, and there's nothing to hold those root systems in place. In a forest, trees grow close enough together that the roots are interlocked in a very strong matrix. So, we're thinking about planting little groves of trees as opposed to single specimens. Visually, they'll function as a group. You will always view them together. So instead of looking for a single specimen tree, you're going to look at three that are interlocked, very stable. They won't blow over on your house. It's a little bit different aesthetic, but that also creates a lot more habitat. It's ideal for someone who's got 3 or 4 acres of lawn and they're wondering what to do. Put in a couple of tree groves and they'll eat up that lawn real quickly.
Good, because we do want to reduce some lawn.
We do want to reduce the lawn.
So one of the things that before we leave the oaks, tell us about keystone plants, because oaks now, I always think of them as keystone plants.
They are the best keystone plant in 84% of the counties in which they occur. Well, picture the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. So I call these really productive plants keystone plants, because if you take them out of the food web collapses. They're making most of the food. So if caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater, and they are, we need plants that make caterpillars. And that's how we measure keystone plants, the ones that have the most caterpillar host records. So oaks, we have recorded 950 species of caterpillars nationwide that use oaks, but we're about to add another 300 host records from, again, Dave Wagner's work. This is going to put them over 1,000 species of caterpillars supported by that one genus of plants. Tulip trees, for example, it's another good native plant, but it only supports 21. So there's a huge difference among many of our native plants. So tulip trees, they're the tallest, straightest tree in the forest, but I would not call them a keystone plant.
Okay. Well, one of the things related to this that I learned from you about when birds are feeding their young, they don't need the seeds from the bird feeder. They require young caterpillars.
Or old caterpillars, but they require caterpillars. Yeah, most baby birds cannot eat seeds. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. Now, finches and doves, crossbills, they're in that 4% that can make a little milk out of seeds, and they can rear their young on seeds. But most of the birds out there, even if they're eating seeds other time of the year, require insects to feed the young because the babies can't digest seeds. So you think, okay, a couple of caterpillars a day, but it's not a couple a day. It's hundreds a day. It's 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of birds to the point where they leave the nest. And that's a tiny chickadee. That's a third of an ounce.
Yes.
That's one nest. So if you want populations of breeding birds, sorry, I'm salivating here, thinking about all these caterpillars. You have to have enough plants to make all those caterpillars. Enough productive plants. Your crepe myrtle's not going to do it.
No.
The tulip tree's not going to do it.
Right. And also, I think I learned to love my black walnut that's right near my house, falling all over everything, because I think it has a caterpillar that is required by is it chickadees? Is that right? But I know it has great caterpillars.
It does have a lot of caterpillars, yeah.
Okay.
Birds aren't for the most part locked into particular species of caterpillars. They're going to take what they can get. They don't like hairy caterpillars. So they really like the inchworms. They like the things without hairs. They can't afford to specialize because there's never enough of one species. There's some exceptions to that. The spruce budworm in the north supports a lot of birds because it's so common. But your black walnut, it's the top 14% of our plants that are keystone species. And black walnut's in there, but it's near the bottom 13 or 14.
Okay. Well, I know there's some wonderful plant lists we can refer to that you've been involved with. I think National Wildlife Federation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation, right?
Yeah. And so I've used that. It's really fantastic. But I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for you to tell us about Homegrown National Park movement. Tell us, what inspired it and what you want to accomplish, and some great examples.
Well, years ago, somebody did a study. Her last name's Molessi. I don't know her first name. Just measuring the amount of lawn that we had in this country. And back then, this was 2005, we had 40 million acres. When I discovered that statistic, I remember it was a Sunday morning. I was sitting in my kitchen. I said, 40 million acres. Well, what if we cut that area in half? That would give us 20 million acres. We could restore right where that lawn is, which is home. And I said, that'd be big enough for a new national park, although I didn't know how big it was. So I started adding up the area of all our major national parks, and you put all of them together, it's still not 20 million acres. So I said, wow, this is going to be the biggest park in the country. So I started talking about it in my talks, and in Nature's Best Hope, I wrote a chapter called Homegrown National Park. But I gave a talk in Connecticut a couple of years ago, and a woman, Michelle Alfanderi, had just retired from essentially a marketing job, a branding job in Manhattan. She was a classic member of the non-choir. She didn't know anything about biodiversity or about conservation. It just wasn't her focus. But she retired, moved up to Connecticut, and one of her neighbors said, oh, this guy's giving a talk, you should come. She had looked at Michelle's property, said, you should come and hear this guy. So Michelle, didn't want to hurt her feelings, and she went to the talk. It was me, and she listened to the talk, and what she saw was a real opportunity to do what she's good at, and that is getting a message to a group that doesn't already have it. And she said, you only talk to the choir. And I said, yeah, it's only the choir that invites me. She said, well, you got to reach the non-choir. And I said, I know, but that means social media. It means all the stuff that I don't do. And she said, well, I do that. And I will help you do it. Now, she's not the first person that offered to help me do it. I'd always turned them down in the past, but this time, I think she hit me at a weak point or something. But it's true, if I'm going to spend all this time talking about it, we need to reach a whole lot more people. So we formed this small nonprofit called Homegrown National Park. The feature of the site, the website, is the map. We want people to register their property on the map. It's free. So you register where your location and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut your area of lawn in half, or reduce it by any amount. Maybe you're going to plant that oak. Maybe you're going to put a flower in an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how much you do, but you put that area down as well. And then you are a member of Homegrown National Park, and your little piece of your county is going to light up with a little firefly. And the object is to see who else in your county is doing this. The object is to get the whole country to light up, to get the message that everybody, not just the tree huggers, is responsible for the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral. And that's the focus of Homegrown National Park. Our challenge has been that, okay, we created a nonprofit. Now you have to run a nonprofit, and that does require money. So not charging has been an issue. We have to depend on donations. We did just hire, or we're in the process of hiring, an executive director, because Michelle and I can't do it alone. I never wanted to do it alone, so people say, well, the idea is yours. The idea is kind of mine, but the execution and making it happen is all Michelle. I had nothing to do with that. So we've got 26,000 members at this point. I think it's 75,000 acres are registered on Homegrown National Park, which is a good start, but we need many millions more. So that's what we're doing. We're spreading the message that there are real ecological benefits to joining Homegrown National Park, and real sociological benefits too. We really are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not just for entertainment, and it's not someplace else. It's got to be where we are. We've got to start coexisting with it. We want that message to go viral. And we got some great examples of how well it works. I'll just use my property really quickly here, because we started with a blank slate. I mean, it was mowed for hay. There was very little here. Put the plants back, and I've been counting the number of caterpillar species that now make a living at my house. It's a lot of them. So it's taken me 5 years so far of catching them and getting pictures of them. But I'm up to 1,199 species of caterpillars that now live here and didn't live here before we put the plants back. And because so many of those caterpillars are types of bird food, we've recorded 61 species of birds that have bred on our property. So conservation works. That's really what motivates me. All I have to do is tell people conservation works, and we need it.
Yes, I mean, we do. It's and you're not losing anything. That's the thing. You're not actually giving anything up. You're just changing your approach and your understanding. And I've seen it impact many people, but I do totally understand how hard it is to reach people who don't care. So I'm hopeful that this hook will work. And another group, and I set up sometimes some teaching to reach landscape contractors, because here in my town we have a pollinator garden that I put in, and we can't find anyone to take care of it. Yeah. This concept of fine gardening is fine gardeners are in short supply.
Yeah. Well, the sad reality is most people don't garden at all. They just hire somebody. That somebody is usually a lawn company. The mow, blow, go guys. They come, they mow, they blow, and they go. And they do it quickly. So I would love to retrain that industry and expand it, create what we call ecological gardeners or ecological landscapers, because most people are still just going to hire somebody, but they can hire somebody who knows what plants ought to be there, how they can be arranged in an aesthetically pleasing way. Those properties still need maintenance.
That's right.
Will do it. They will know how to maintain. They'll know where the leaves need to stay on your property. They'll know how to cut back that little pocket meadow they put in. And the busy homeowner won't have to worry about it. That's where we want to get.
Yeah.
We also need to convince developers to landscape properly from the get-go. And then if the homeowner who buys that property wants to change it, it's up to them.
Yes.
Now it's landscaped improperly, and the homeowner has to spend a lot of money and time trying to change it back. And that's a big obstacle.
Oh, it really is. And also because they take the deeper soil and put it on top, and plants don't want to grow in that.
Yeah. Yeah. They sell the topsoil.
Yeah.
And you have nothing but subsoil, which can be restored, but it takes time.
It does. It really does. So we're gonna help spread the word about homegrown national parks and encourage people. I know I'm gonna join, and I'm gonna try to get a lot of other people to join, and then help spread the word.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So I think we're almost time for questions. Don't you think so, Courtney? I know Courtney's here, and I know we have questions.
I am, absolutely. Here we are. I have been monitoring the Q&A throughout our time, and can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. We've gotten a couple of questions that are about alternative trees to oaks because of people's property size. So for instance, if people are not able to have trees that will grow to 60 feet, or that will need a larger area to spread its roots, what are some of the smaller trees that you would recommend for those kinds of properties?
Well, first of all, there are some species of smaller oaks. So the dwarf chestnut oak, Quercus praenoides, is a good example. There's a dwarf variety of the live oak, the southern live oak, Quercus virginianum, minima. So that one with the great big spreading branches and all the Spanish moss. You can get a small variety of that too. But other trees, it depends on where you live. But there's a tie for the second most productive genus, and it's native willows and native prunus, native cherries. So things like American plum and Chickasaw plum, those are not big plants. Pin cherry is not a big plant either, and those are all really productive. Many of our willows are quite small. Black willow is one of the biggest, but there are many other species of willows that you could sneak in here and there. Birches are very productive plants. That people always plant river birch, and they plant it small, but it grows too. It gets to be a pretty big tree. So
there was actually somebody mentioning about river birch in the comments, and about the wetness of the area, clay soil. Is it all right to plant it in a wet clay area?
Well, it's always right plant, right place. So there. It's funny because pin oak's a very popular street tree. That's Quercus palustris, oak of the swamp. It doesn't want to be a street tree. It wants to be in a wetter area. So does swamp white oak, swamp chestnut oak. So putting the plant where it wants to be is going to make a much happier plant. But we have a number of productive shrubs as well. Our native viburnums are all very productive. Now they're not tiny little gumdrops. Viburnum dentatum will easily get to be 10 feet tall, but if that's going to be your tree, that's okay.
Yeah, excellent. Going over to a different type of question, you spoke about nativars, your thoughts on nativars. If you plant a nativar and it spreads, this is the question, or you collect seeds or cuttings and propagate, are they still considered clonal and still lacking in genetic diversity?
If your plant reproduces sexually, it's not clonal anymore. And then you do have a lot more genetic variability. So, but a lot of the cultivars, when they cross maybe with a wild member or even with themselves, that's sexual reproduction. And a lot of times the trait that you were desiring will disappear. So yeah, having sexual reproduction is a good thing.
Going to the keystone plants, and Holly, you spoke to that quite a bit. Who would you say is doing the best research on keystone plants, and what are they working on?
Well, the only group I know that's working on keystone plants is my lab. So at this point, what we've been doing is just scouring the literature and getting host plant records from the last 100 years from around the country. That has proved to be so popular because people want to know what are the most productive plants, that we're now expanding that, and we're doing it around the world. We're doing it globally. BlackRock Bank has he approached me and said, we want to know what the keystone plants are for every one of our offices around the world. They've got a lot of offices in every single country. So we've been working on that for about 1.5 years. And that's a great start into providing the list of the productive plants for all the people that want to plant plants for climate change. So there's the Trillion Tree Project and all these million tree projects around. But in so many places, they're just planting eucalyptus. They're only thinking about carbon sequestration. Boy, what a lost opportunity. If we're going to put trees in the ground, let's put the trees that belong in that place that'll support the biodiversity that's equally important crisis on this planet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another attendee is asking, can you explain the 70% natives number that you mentioned in your book and where that comes from?
That comes from my PhD student's Desiree Narango's work, where she studied chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So right away, that's one study on one bird. And I report it, but people are extrapolating that to be this law of nature that applies everywhere. They're way over extrapolating it. But what she found is that if you have at least 70% of your woody plant biomass native, and she didn't even divide it into keystone plants, not yet anyway, we still have the data to do that. You can have a sustainable food web that will sustain chickadees, that will produce those thousands of caterpillars they need to fledge. That's so 30% can be non-invasive, non-natives. We can't tolerate invasives because they don't stay 30%. They escape and they're ecological tumors. But that's where the 30-70 came. 70% is natives. And once we look at the plants that she had in these residential landscapes and divide it into keystone plants versus not, it'll probably be less than that because the keystone plants are so productive, less than 70% required.
Thank you. I'm also very intrigued by this one. Do you have any advice about how we can go about encouraging our city parks and rec department to plant and nurture native plants? So relationships with government or city officials, what would be your recommendations on that?
Both. Our city officials are elected officials, and if we make it clear that these are important issues to us, they will help change these age-old practices. You know, the people maintaining city properties are doing it the way they've always done it. There's no reason to change. Well, there is a reason to change. They just don't know about it. So we have to pressure the elected officials into making it happen. It is changing. It is changing. I'm seeing more and more ordinances being written. It's changing a little slower in the South than in the North, but it is changing. So, you know, the biggest pushback we get is from homeowners associations, which they're not elected officially. You just join your homeowners association, and they want to make sure that we don't lose property value by having messy yards. That's what it boils down to. So they've got all these regulations. So we have to, when we convert to a greater percentage of natives, we have to do it tastefully. We have to use lawn as a cue for care. We're not just going to stop mowing our lawn. The lawn we keep is going to be manicured. And demonstrate that you can have beautiful yards that are ecologically functional without reducing property values. And then these restrictions will start to disappear.
Thank you. Another question that came up, and I definitely, Holly, I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these as well.
Mhm.
Recently heard the term semi-native plants, planting native trees at the edge of their growing zone to spread the plants quicker than nature. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're talking about assisted migration, where, we're going to move southern plants north because the planet's going to get warmer. And in general, the planet is getting warmer. And if you're talking about moving a plant just a short distance, so that, and especially if you do it incrementally, so that the things that are associated with a plant can follow it, I don't have a big problem with it. But if you're taking plants from Georgia and moving them up to Pennsylvania, then you're moving them, out of their provenance, out of their historical range, even if it's a genotype of a particular plant. And then you're reducing that very important value of contributing to the local food web. So semi-native, remember, natives do move around, and they are moving now, and helping them out a little bit is okay. Pushing that envelope a little too far, we've got to be very careful about that.
Thank you. We have a question about the new law on running bamboo and how to get rid of it. But I think it's also a larger question on, the impact of something like bamboo. And if you can speak to that and why these kinds of laws have been put in place and what you see as the impact on the larger systems for things like bamboo.
Well, it's a particularly aggressive, invasive plant. It contributes nothing to our local ecosystem, and it doesn't stay on your property, which is why people are reacting to it. It's extremely hard to get rid of. You need a backhoe. I would like to see those kind of restrictions on all of the invasive plants, though, because when burning bush escapes into our natural areas and displaces everything else. And by the way, they're not displacing everything else by themselves. They've got a lot of help from too many deer, overabundance of deer that eat everything else and don't eat the non-natives. And that's why the non-natives are so successful in our natural areas. But that's been devastating. Bamboo is just a particularly tough example. English ivy, particularly in the West, is a real tough one. A lot of tough ones out there.
Here in Montgomery County, Maryland, I testified recently to say that it should be outlawed to sell invasive bamboo, to sell and plant it. And the law passed. So that's a start.
Yeah.
And a lot of the elected officials said, oh, yes, I've had many people complain about it and what to do about it. So I see some of it happening, but it needs to happen fast.
Yeah, bamboo has been outlawed in Dover, Delaware for decades now.
Okay.
Because of a single woman who pushed it. But I talk about what happens on our properties. It's not like Las Vegas. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. But what happens on our properties, it does not stay on our properties. We're impacting everything around us. And we have to start thinking of it that way. It's a modification of that property rights idea. We get it that we can't, just because it's our property, we can't release smallpox spores on our property. Well, when you're planting an invasive plant, that's essentially what you're doing.
Doug, when you mentioned about deer, we got an influx of different Q&A questions about that. About the fact that, as you say, the deer really eat the natives. We're getting examples here like rhododendron maximum, Kalmia Solomon's seal. What's to be done? What are your recommendations on that?
Again, that's a sociological problem. We know how to control deer. We just have decided not to do it. It's very curious. When the Fed is going to adjust the interest rates, they don't consult me about it. They just do it. And they shouldn't consult me about it. I know nothing about it. I am not an economist. But when it comes to making ecological policy, we do consult the general public, who knows very little about ecology. It's a very curious situation. So there's a big public outcry against trying to control deer. We have to control deer, either with natural predators, which people also don't like, or We control them ourselves. Right now, the only thing controlling deer in so many places of the country are cars. We hit them. There's 1,000 people a year killed by deer collisions in cars. It's not a good solution. The deer at my house now are so hungry that they're actually eating all the spice bush. That's never happened since we've been here. And they look terrible. So that's not healthy for the deer. We've got to get them back way below the carrying capacity. They're 3, 4, 5 times over the carrying capacity, the ability of the environment to support them. And that has resulted in our forest understories being eliminated. There's no recruitment. So when the old trees fall over, there's no babies to replace them. It's ecologically devastating over the long term.
Thank you. I think we have time for another couple of questions. We have a good one here that's it's about neighbors. If our neighbors use pesticides, what can we do to protect the native insects in our yard?
Well, not all that much. It depends on what pesticide they're using and how they apply it. The ideal situation would be to convince your neighbor they don't need those pesticides. That would be the ideal approach, which is why I write the books and give these talks. And, we've got entomophobia. We just want to kill all the insects, whether we need to or not. 1929, we had National Insect Killing Week. It was a week designed to promote the use of all brands of chemicals so that we could rid the community of insects. That's a quote from the paper. So a lot of people still have that in their mind. And it's, if you own a piece of the earth, you have the responsibility of taking care of that piece of the earth. And as E.O. Wilson told us in 1987, insects are the little things that run the world. It is totally irresponsible to be killing everything on your property.
Well, one of the things that we did where I live, some of our dogs were dying, and the residents thought that it was because of the pesticides people were using on their lawns. So the mayor asked me to be head of the environmental committee. And not everybody wanted to stop using ChemLawn or some company. So I set up educational programs, and we watched a video of Doug, and we watched, I've had people come in, and it's a long, slow process. That's why I put in the pollinator garden, and then we consult people at their house. So we do some things, but it takes time. Oh, lastly, this is what I wanted to say. In Maryland, we have something called Sustainable Maryland Towns. And so our town became a sustainable town. And so there are requirements for that. And so that was a good way to monitor and kind of come together on what it means to be a sustainable town. And now we're applying for grants so we can put in native plant bioretention areas. And so it's a process, but it can happen if you just take some interested residents.
Yeah, that's that culture change that I'm talking about. We want it to be second nature, that everybody understands why we have to do this. And we're moving in that direction. So I am encouraged.
All right. And I think we will end on one last question, which there are a couple of people who have asked something in this realm. So it's on how to remove invasives and what your recommendations are on approaches for invasive plants.
There's a lot of kinds of invasive plants, but a wonderful way to remove the woodies is with a mattock. It's like a pickaxe with a very broad end on one end. Couple whacks at the root system, and even 10-foot Elaeagnus autumn olive will come popping out. You can push the branches of the multiflora rose down and whack out those roots. I'm in love with my mattock. I use it all the time. You can get a little hand mattock, and that's great for smaller things, the Japanese honeysuckle and the things that root along. Porcelain berry, terrible invasive now. We've got to get out those big root systems. And a mattock's a great way to do it without herbicides. I don't like to spray herbicides because it hits all the non-targets. But for bigger things that you can saw off the trunk and then paint the trunk with an herbicide that's preferably one that has oil base, and it'll get down into the root systems. Uses very little material. But if you don't kill the roots, it just keeps coming back. So a lot of people mow their meadows to control the woody invasives. It doesn't control them. It postpones the time they're going to come roaring back. You've got to kill the root systems.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. And Holly or Doug, are there any final comments that you would like to share before we wrap up the program?
Well, I always like to emphasize that personal responsibility part, that the new idea that no matter who you are, really, it's your responsibility to maintain your property, big or small, in an ecologically productive way. Because when we change the color, when everybody does that, that's gonna solve the problem. That's the future of conservation.
And I would just say I second that, and I've been trying to, over time, as I've been learning, it is working. More birds, more life, more beauty. So it works.
Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
thank you, Doug. I know how much we have all really loved hearing you. I wanted to tell people that you can go on the website for Homegrown National Parks, and there's a really good video of Doug talking about some of the things we talked about tonight and many other things. So please go onto that website. It's easy. When you type it in, it comes right up and the video is right there. So Doug, I just want to thank you for the work you do. I want to thank you for what you've been able to do and what you continue to do in your teaching and spreading this message far and wide. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Holly. I appreciate the support.
Right. And thanks to both of you for a wonderful evening and all of your insights on how to improve the world through ecological gardening. I think it's given us all a lot to think about. So thank you both for joining us for this conversation. A few announcements before we end this webinar for everyone who's been watching. For those who enjoyed tonight's program and would like to see it again, we do plan to put a recording available soon on our YouTube channel, the AHS YouTube channel. There will also be 2 more programs in this year's Great American Gardeners webinar series. On June 14th, Holly will be in conversation with Ira Wallace, the owner of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. And on August 23rd, Holly will be in conversation with Dr. Lucinda McDade, who is the executive director of the California Botanic Garden. So if you have not already registered for those sessions, you can do so on the American Horticultural Society website. We also value your feedback and your ideas as we plan for future AHS programs. So immediately after this webinar, all the registrants will receive a survey, and this will give you an opportunity to offer feedback on tonight's program and also to share about your interests and preferences for the future of AHS programs. So please take a couple of minutes to complete that survey. And with that, thank you so much for spending the past hour with us. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon at an American Horticultural Society program. Good night, everyone.
Bye.